The Bible, far from being merely literature, is a living record brimming with such vivacious historicity that it warrants its own specialized discipline, biblical archaeology. Time and again, this field has reduced the skepticism of prominent scholars to little more than pie-in-the-face moments, as their assertions of myth crumble under the wake of mounting evidence. Take John the Baptist, for instance. Once dismissed as a legendary figure, not only does Josephus, the Jewish historian, reference him in Antiquities of the Jews, but the archaeological site, Bethany beyond the Jordan, has been recognized by UNESCO as his baptizing ground. This sacred location, venerated since the Byzantine era, stands as a testament to the historical foundation of his role in biblical narratives. Then there's Herod the Great, remembered as both builder and butcher. The Encyclopedia Britannica itself corroborates the New Testament's chilling account of the massacre of Bethlehem's infants, describing it as entirely consistent with Herod's notorious cruelty, a man consumed by the chaos of his waning power. Archaeological findings have also brought to light the Pool of Siloam, where the Good News of John recounts Jesus healing a blind man. Situated in the ancient city of David, this sacred pool stands adjacent to Christian tradition and confirms yet another biblical narrative previously dismissed as fanciful. Even Egypt, the land of enslavement, offers traces of corroboration. The Hyksos settlement in Avaris hints at the presence of Semitic peoples, and the Brooklyn Papyrus lists Asiatic slaves in Egypt during the 13th dynasty. The mention of Semitic names strongly aligns with the biblical account of Hebrew slaves, a connection strengthened by Josephus's identification of the Hyksos as his ancestors. Jericho, with its walls fallen and evidence of fire, echoes the biblical conquest described in Joshua. Similarly, excavations in Jerusalem and discoveries like the Tel Dan inscription have reinforced the historicity of figures such as King David and sites central to biblical history. These findings anchor the narrative firmly within the annals of archaeology, defying those who once scoffed at their plausibility. Time and again, archaeology has revealed that the so-called myths of the Bible are not mere inventions, but historical accounts waiting to be uncovered. Whether it's the Philistines and their cities, King Hezekiah's royal seal, or the city of Ur where Abraham began his journey, these discoveries challenge the modern dismissal of the Tanakh as mere literature. It is a collection of history infused with the divine, vibrant in its ability to bring the past to life and demand its place in the annals of our shared human story. History, particularly in ancient times, was not a passive record of events, but an active tool wielded by the ruling powers to craft narratives that served their interests. Egypt, among other nations, was notorious for practicing damnatio memoriae, the systematic erasure of individuals or events from their historical records when they were perceived as shameful, rebellious, or damaging to the state's image. Consider the Exodus, which recounts a traitor to Pharaoh, a member of his own family, leading a devastating rebellion against Egypt. This episode culminates in the utter decimation of the empire and ends with Egypt begging its enslaved workforce to leave. Such a humiliating sequence of events would have posed an existential threat to the pharaoh's divine authority. It's no wonder, then, that the Exodus might have been deliberately stricken from Egypt's official records. However, history has a way of preserving truths, even in the face of systematic erasure, leaving behind trace evidence such as oral traditions, archaeological findings, and reinterpreted fragments of historical records. These remnants, though incomplete, remain significant enough to challenge the notion of total erasure. Artifacts like the Brooklyn Papyrus mention Asiatic peoples, possibly the Hebrews, among Egypt's slaves, providing tantalizing evidence that supports the Exodus narrative. Additionally, shifts in population and infrastructure in the ancient Near East hinted disruptions consistent with such an event. These fragments, though seemingly small, are pieces of a larger puzzle that resist being dismissed outright. The practice of damnatio memoriae was so pervasive in Egypt that even pharaohs were not immune. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most fascinating rulers, offers a striking example. Her unconventional rise to power as a female pharaoh prompted her to adopt male regalia to assert her authority, a daring move that marked her reign with peace and prosperity, as evidenced by her ambitious building projects and trade expeditions. Yet after her death, her stepson, Thutmose III, may have orchestrated the defacement of her monuments and the removal of her name from historical records, leaving her legacy fragmented and vulnerable to obscurity. Even as her reign is debated, its traces persist, hinting at the resilience of truth against deliberate erasure. If such measures could be taken against a ruler as prominent as Hatshepsut, it is entirely conceivable that the memory of a cataclysmic event like the Exodus, which directly threatened Egypt's foundational identity, could also be buried under layers of silence. Yet, trace evidence survives in the form of undeniable remnants, artifacts, accounts, and patterns that continue to shed light on the truth. These fragments are substantial in their own right and offer invaluable insights into an event that defied erasure and shaped history itself. The admonitions of an Egyptian sage, attributed to the scribe Ipuwer, stands as a singular artifact of ancient Egyptian history. Its sole surviving copy bears witness to a narrative so raw and chaotic that scholars have struggled to reconcile its contradictions. Ipuwer, a high-ranking figure with access to address the pharaoh himself, describes a nation in upheaval, slaves departing, laden with gold and fine clothing, amidst calamities that engulf the land. Dismissed by some as a fanciful or confused account, the text takes on a powerful resonance when viewed through the lens of the Exodus story. This is where the magic happens, where history and the supernatural converge, unveiling the Bible as a collection of profoundly historical documents rather than mere literary constructs. The parallels are striking. Ipuwer recounts, "Behold, Egypt is fallen to the pouring of water, and he who poured water on the ground seizes the mighty in misery." Juxtapose this with Exodus 4:9, where Moses is commanded to pour water from the Nile onto the dry ground, transforming it into blood before the eyes of Pharaoh. Suddenly, what seemed chaotic and symbolic becomes clear, a supernatural event shaking the foundations of Egyptian power. Ipuwer laments, "All the water in the Nile turned into blood, and the fish in the Nile died, and the river reeked, so that Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile." Plus, this directly mirrors the account in Exodus 7:20 through 21, where Moses and Aaron, obeying Elohim's command, smite the waters of the Nile, turning them to blood. The stench of death fills the river, leaving it undrinkable, an ecological disaster recorded in both the sage's lament and the sacred text. The calamities grow more intense. Ipuwer writes of fire and hail raining down, livestock perishing, and crops being smitten. Events vividly depicted in Exodus 9:24 through 25, where hail mingled with fire descends upon the land, destroying both life and vegetation. It is as though both texts, one secular and one sacred, describe the same divine reckoning in harrowing detail. But the devastation doesn't end there. Plagues sweep the land, Ipuwer continues. Blood is everywhere, with no shortage of the dead. He who buries his brother in the ground is everywhere. Woe is me for the grief of this time. Compare this to Exodus 12:30, which recounts the great cry that rose throughout Egypt after the death of the firstborn. In both narratives, the wails of mourning pierce through the chaos, underscoring the immense loss and despair. Finally, the contradictions that have puzzled scholars, slaves leaving Egypt adorned with treasures, find their clarity when placed side by side with the Bible. Ipuwer observes, "People are stripped of clothes. The slave takes what he finds. Gold, lapis lazuli, silver, and turquoise are strung about the necks of female slaves." Exodus 12:35 through 36 completes the picture, where the Israelites, following Moses' instructions, Ask the Egyptians for silver, gold, and raiment. The Egyptians, desperate to see the Hebrews depart after the plagues, willingly hand over their treasures, fulfilling what Epuer describes. These parallels aren't merely coincidences. They point to a deeper truth, that the Exodus narrative, once dismissed as mere myth, echoes through history in ways that demand attention. Epuer's contradictions dissolve when viewed in tandem with the Bible. They aren't contradictions at all, but fragments of a shared memory of divine intervention. Together, they challenge us to see the supernatural as an integral part of history, not as a relic of belief, but as a force that shaped events recorded in both sacred and secular texts. In the end, the admonitions of an Egyptian sage doesn't undermine the Bible's credibility, it enhances it, providing yet another example of how the supposed myths of the past are, in truth, the realities that shaped our world. The Bible, far from being a collection of mere stories, stands as a testament to the intertwining of human history and the divine. The absence of Moses in Epuer's admonitions of an Egyptian sage aligns remarkably well with the concept of damnatio memoriae, the systematic erasure of individuals or events deemed too detrimental to a nation's legacy. If Moses led a catastrophic rebellion that decimated Egypt's power and prestige, it would make sense for his name to be conspicuously absent from Egyptian records, even when the events themselves, like the plagues in the Exodus, are alluded to. This deliberate omission highlights an intriguing paradox. While Egypt may have sought to erase Moses from its official history, the traces of his impact were simply too significant to fully suppress. Epuer's account, though vague on certain figures, captures a vivid picture of chaos and upheaval that perfectly complements the biblical narrative. It's as though Moses' legacy exists in the negative space, felt in the echoes of destruction and liberation described by Epuer, but left unspoken as a final act of state censorship. This lack of mention doesn't diminish Moses' historicity. In fact, it strengthens the argument that his actions were profound enough to warrant suppression. It aligns with the broader understanding of damnatio memoriae, whereby individuals who posed a grave threat to the status quo were erased in name, though their deeds reverberated through time. In the case of Moses, his story survived not in Egyptian inscriptions, but in the robust preservation of the Hebrew Scriptures, leaving an indelible mark on human history. Scholars often contend that the lack of pottery evidence undermines the historical authenticity of the Exodus as described in the Torah. However, this argument is grounded in assumptions so fantastical that they verge on outright absurdity. Are we truly meant to picture a horde of fleeing Israelite slaves, lugging enormous, fully operational bottle kilns through the harsh wilderness? As though, amidst their desperate escape from centuries of oppression, their primary concern was sustaining a thriving pottery enterprise. The idea is laughable, were it not for the fact that some academic critiques actually give it credence. And then there's the expectation of uncovering pristine, high-quality Egyptian pottery attributed to a group of impoverished slaves. According to the Exodus account, the closest thing to pottery the slaves brought with them were their kneading troughs. Exodus 12:34. And the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading troughs being bound up in their clothes upon their shoulders. Would we expect to find crystal goblets and gilded platters among the refuse of the oppressed? The notion betrays a baffling detachment from reality, as though these runaway nomads somehow acquired the craftsmanship reserved for the Egyptian elite. This line of reasoning is not only misguided, but outright preposterous. What we're left with is a flimsy straw man, a poorly constructed and deeply unrealistic argument, wielded to dismiss the Exodus narrative altogether. The absence of pottery, rather than being a compelling critique, reflects a desire to discredit one of the most profound stories in biblical history, without confronting its far-reaching implications. The lack of pottery evidence becomes conspiratorial in nature, especially when one considers the transformative repercussions of proving the Exodus true. Such confirmation would overturn established worldviews, redefine historical paradigms,
and affirm a divine narrative that many would prefer to consign to myth. By fixating on this fragile pottery argument, skeptics fail to grasp the greater truths. The nomadic lifestyle of the Israelite exiles, their resilience and faith, their resourcefulness despite immense hardship, these are not measured by artifacts they didn't even possess. The lasting legacy of their journey transcends physical evidence, reaching into the hearts and faith of millions across generations. That's the perspective worth considering, even if it doesn't conform neatly to an academic checklist. The absence of pottery among ancient Semitic nomads, such as the Shasu, and Palestinian nomads, is not only expected, it is thoroughly supported by archaeological evidence and historical analysis. Pottery was a hallmark of settled agricultural societies, used primarily for storing and cooking grains or other produce. However, among pastoral nomads, whose subsistence was based on herding and mobility, pottery was neither practical nor necessary. Semitic groups like the Shasu, identified in Egyptian texts, monuments, and reliefs, were described as a fluid social class rather than a fixed ethnic group. Their name, possibly derived from the Egyptian verb to wander, aptly reflects their nomadic lifestyle. These Shasu roamed vast tracts of the southern Levant, their lives shaped by pastoralism rather than agricultural practices. As Thomas E. Levy noted in his excavation findings, pure pastoral nomadism is characterized by the absence of agriculture, even in supplementary forms. Thus, the Shasu would have had little use for pottery, a craft directly tied to agricultural storage. In fact, the traditions of Palestinian nomads align with this view. According to École biblique and archéologique française, in their article, Potter's skill is inherited from a multi-secular tradition, published on the 1st of May in the year 2023. Palestinian nomads made domestic dishes by hand, using ancient coiling techniques, firing them without a closed kiln. Even this rudimentary pottery, which resembled techniques from 5,500 years ago, appeared in Palestine only after the Mamelukes forced them to settle in the 14th century. By tradition, nomads simply didn't engage in pottery making, a point supported by a striking statistic in an article titled Pottery Mobility by Jelmer W. Eerkens, a faculty member at UC Davis, which states that less than one-third of nomadic people worldwide engaged in making pottery. Additionally, identifying nomadic communities through archaeology remains notoriously difficult. Ephemeral tent camps and organic materials, like shrubs used for corrals, often fail to survive erosion or sediment deposition over time. Human cultural processes and limited familiarity with nomadic material culture further complicate the task. This challenges the credibility of expecting pottery as evidence of the Exodus. To presume that a nomadic group would leave behind extensive ceramic artifacts ignores the practical realities of their lifestyle. Moreover, the deserts of the Levant provided freshwater springs and favorable conditions for herding, making pastoralism sustainable for centuries, without the need for agricultural goods stored in pottery. As early as the Chalcolithic period, pastoral nomads thrived in areas like the Sinai and Negev, marking a lineage of resilience and adaptation among groups like the Shasu. This evidence decisively counters modern pottery biases that dismiss the Exodus narrative based on the absence of ceramics. These arguments not only misrepresent nomadic societies, but also construct a straw man. The notion that nomads would craft and carry heavy pottery is both impractical and absurd. Instead, pottery marks a shift to sedentary life, a transition forced by external pressures, not inherent to nomadic culture. The biblical account fits comfortably within this framework. The Israelites, identified under the Shasu umbrella, lived as pastoral nomads during their journey, as described in Exodus. It was only after military conquests in the Levant, where they inherited cities and vineyards they had not built or planted, as recorded in Joshua 24:12-14, that they adopted a semi-sedentary lifestyle. Their eventual settlement was marked not by a culture of ceramic artifacts, but by divine intervention and survival against overwhelming odds. Far from discrediting the Exodus narrative, the absence of pottery serves as a testament to the resilience, resourcefulness, and authenticity of nomadic life. The critiques relying on pottery evidence are not only unrealistic, but conspiratorial in nature, seeking to diminish the profound impact the Exodus would have on historical and theological paradigms if proven true. Secular scholars have often unapologetically demonstrated a bias against the Bible, reducing its profound significance to mere literature. Such a dismissal reveals a deep disconnect from reality, as the historicity of the Bible has been proven true repeatedly. Yet, these intellectuals persist with unsubstantiated claims, labeling the Bible as a collection of myths based solely on their disbelief in the supernatural. Even when faced with compelling evidence, like the case of Epuer's papyrus, they retreat into denial, resembling patients unable to confront uncomfortable truths. This bias becomes glaringly apparent when examining the arguments surrounding the Exodus and the existence of Moses. Scholars often cling to subjective methodologies, such as using pottery, or the alleged lack thereof, of Semitic nomads to dismiss the Exodus narrative. They conveniently ignore the massive deposits of pottery associated with semi-sedentary nomads from the New Kingdom period, even when discovered in the very regions relevant to the Exodus event. Are these scholars being deceitful or simply evading evidence that challenges their ideological framework? Perhaps they are purposefully disregarding evidence from alternative time periods that may align with the biblical account. Documentaries such as Exodus, Patterns of Evidence, have meticulously presented the abundance of evidence supporting a Middle Kingdom Exodus. Epuer's papyrus, in particular, stands out as a striking piece of evidence, vividly echoing the plagues and turmoil described in the biblical account. Yet, because of its fantastical events and Middle Kingdom dating, it is dismissed outright by critics, a reflection of the entrenched bias against the supernatural and biblical narratives. This modern pottery bias, however, is especially troubling. The expectation of discovering abundant, durable artifacts from a transient and oppressed population is not only unrealistic, but also defies common sense. Semi-sedentary nomads like the Shasu, whose pottery aligns with the New Kingdom timeline, are entirely dismissed. Another critical point is the Hebrews' transition to a semi-sedentary lifestyle. This shift occurred only after their military campaigns, as they took over the cities of their conquered foes. As highlighted in Joshua 24:12-14, their settlement in existing towns and their use of agricultural infrastructure were the result of divine intervention, not their own labor. This aligns with the Canaanite linguistic and cultural framework, as they shared ties with the Phoenicians, with only small deviations. This context further challenges modern pottery biases, as the Hebrews' nomadic and military lifestyle during the Exodus meant they were not creating substantial pottery evidence. Their lack of a distinct semi-sedentary material culture prior to their conquest speaks volumes about their transient nature and defies the flawed methodology that equates pottery abundance with historical validity. Moreover, recent archaeological studies shed light on glaring omissions of data. For instance, surveys of southern Jordan reveal significant pottery deposits from the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. However, the interpretation of these findings remains controversial, with trial excavations casting doubt on previous survey conclusions. This raises concerns about whether traditional scholarship selectively constructs arguments that marginalize the biblical narrative to uphold secular ideologies. The debates over the Late Bronze Age through Iron Age transition in southern Jordan underscore the need for a more nuanced approach. By relying on potentially flawed data, critical scholars risk perpetuating a straw man that dismisses the Bible's validity. A more balanced perspective reveals that the evidence, when properly examined, supports a narrative that aligns with biblical accounts challenging rigid secular frameworks and opening the door to deeper truths. It's one of those deliciously ironic moments in the realm of academia, the ultimate pie in the face for anti-Exodus scholars. There they were, confidently asserting in a documentary that the Hyksos were not Hebrew people, only for National Geographic to swoop in with their Atlas of the Bible and declare the Hyksos as indeed Hebrew peoples. Oh, the poetry of it all! One could almost hear the splat of a cream pie hitting its target as the truth came barreling in, leaving their outdated claims smeared beyond recognition. Reality, it seems, is the big clown, serving up a helping of poetic justice with a side of unrelenting facts. But the big clown wasn't done yet. That heavy-handed pie assault landed so hard, it left those critics snoozing like little messy angels, resting sweetly in the aftermath of their toppled narratives. There's a certain charm in knowing that truth, when it hits, doesn't just challenge, it humbles, transforms, and leaves behind a trail of laughter and clarity. The scholars thought they had the upper hand, but they were no match for the clown car of undeniable evidence that came screeching onto the scene. And speaking of irony, isn't it something how the modern secular narrative often resembles a tourist lost in their own hometown? Constantly backpedaling, resetting course, and recalibrating their theories, they resemble someone grappling with memory loss, unable to navigate familiar territory, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge the wisdom of the ancients. It's almost tragic, like a clown trying to juggle while forgetting where they left their unicycle. Yet, here we stand, pointing to the evidence they so adamantly deny. Whether it's pottery or the absence of it, there's no shortage of proof for the Semitic nomads of the Exodus. The Shasu, for example, somehow managed to leave pottery in the Levant during the exact period scholars demand evidence for the Exodus. It's almost as if they reached across time with an extended clown arm, hurling pies straight at today's detractors. And oh, what a glorious sight it is, seeing their arguments crumble beneath the weight of undeniable truth, one splat at a time,